It was carried in 1976.
Capitol building, Washington, D.C.
The museum occupies 75,000 acres of science, literature, and art. In the year 1492, Christopher Columbus and 3 ships discovered the New World, America. Well, he thought it was India, and even today, the natives are called Indians.
When you come down into some of these cases, we have things that, well, these are all from Labrador too, but every now and then there's something that will be, you know, like from Hudsons Bay territory, which could be a lost Inuvialuit piece. You know, like to me this is interesting because it's got baleen, webbing. So, you know, were people doing that around Hudsons Bay, or is that a Western Arctic Carnival?
These two would be the same.
Inuvialuit are a very proud people, and like many of the groups in North America, many of the Aboriginal groups, they're increasingly connected to their past as a source of pride in the present. And so there's a lot of educational work going on around that. And so this is a form of kind of community development and education.
You know, we've been a lot of talk about this project for so long, but one of the things that we're excited about is nobody's ever really taken a careful look at some of these objects, and certainly not with the knowledge of Inuvialuit people from the region that sort of know more about these things. So this is a wonderful opportunity for us to learn about the pieces and to begin to build a dialogue that might lead to exhibitions or books or programs or really whatever it is that you'd like to do with these things.
I met Kathy and Mervyn many years ago and started or became more familiar with this collection, and also through meeting Stephen Loring. And then all of a sudden we thought, well, really we should bring the objects to the elders, or the elders to the objects. And seeing as it was kind of prohibitive to bring the collection north, we went the other direction.
And you can see about the size of a football playing field. And in each of the boxes are just all the collections from all over the world. We've got some photographs here from the way things used to be up in the attic, where everything was just kind of piled together, and now everything has been nicely sorted and put into conservation good space. The collection is stored both geographically and then by shape. So most of the McFarland collection, most of the Inuvialuit material is up on the second floor, which is where we'll go. But some of the big pieces of clothing are right here. So let's just look at those, and then we'll go upstairs. The lower garments here are caribou skin robes with some of the early beads and skin work. But I think what we'll do when we want to look at these more closely is just put them out bring them out and put them on a table.
To me, it's really amazing for me to, you know, to see and actually hold objects and tools and weapons for hunting that was used, you know, 150 years ago. Or it's really amazing.
This trip for myself and the rest of the group, I think, has been a really good experience to be able to see clothing, the artifacts, the different tools and weapons that were used by our people years ago, and the preservation of them with the McFarland collection that was brought down here. Like some of these weapons that they use, I've never ever seen them before, and it's quite interesting to actually be holding one in my hand, wondering how many birds or animals that person harvested with a weapon like this.
Me personally, it's like, well, I see these in the books, and then Kathy for me as well. It's, you know, it's a chance, but I didn't want to pass up to see them. The garment itself that's been actually made over 100 years ago.
And I actually, like I mentioned, you know, I saw some of the old tools and objects such as ulut and harpoons, spears, bow and arrows, still being used, but not as much, you know, because it was passed down from way back, eh? So it's amazing for me, it's to see and hold objects from, you know, from my ancestors.
We talked a little bit about wearing gloves, and it's sometimes I tell people, it's your cultural heritage. It's do what you want to do. We're just taking care of this material for you. But I encourage people to wear gloves because some of these skins, especially, because they've been in the museum now for like 160 years, and in the 1880s, in order to keep the bugs from eating the fur, they dusted it with mercury and arsenic. Now there's not a lot because they've gone in and vacuumed everything off, but it's still probably better, and so I encourage people to wear mittens. And then it's also like with iron objects or with glass objects, if you have gloves on, it doesn't, your sweat doesn't get on the object, and it's just a way of helping to preserve it.
When they traded with the Inuveli, there was any documentation, like a receipt to the individual Inuveli?
I doubt it.
Those are not, they're not around, eh?
Well, certainly any receipt that the Inuvialuit received, there wouldn't, that, you know, people wouldn't have kept paper like that in those days. Often, sometimes in the logbooks, there's a reference to how much he paid for it or what was traded for. And sometimes, when you're lucky enough, you get actual names of people, you know, who brought this, who it was acquired from. For me, what's so exciting about this project is, for many, many years, these collections that we have, these anthropology collections, these ethnographic collections, were sort of the purview of a few scientists and, you know, researchers, archaeologists, you know, anthropologists. They would come, they would look at a few things, they might take pictures of them, they might write an article about them. But since about 1995, there's been a real revolution in museum studies.
There was a big story about it, and Emmanuel said, just leave it, because anywhere in the coast, if you dig, you'll find artifacts.
And probably in Petito's.
So there's no use fighting over it.
You know, when we was kids, you know, when the water get really low sometimes, we could find
How do you spell that?
some artifacts, bone
That, again,
things like
I think some of those drawings.
Things come to the museum is such an interesting story. You know, there's Japanese armor in the next case over, which was a gift from the Emperor of Japan to Teddy Roosevelt. So it ends up at the Smithsonian. It ends up in the national collections. So these are called the national collections, and by dint of their rarity and their good state of preservation stuff, they'll always be cared for. I mean, there's just this really is a state-of-the-art facility, and for so many years the museum has felt they own these things, and in some way I suppose we do, but more and more, I think, in this climate of repatriation, it's one that's exploring ways like this group's travel here to make this material more broadly known and more broadly accessible.
I think the most important part is we now have an avenue and a way to access these things to be shown to our people in our area.
Rodrick McFarland worked for the Hudsons Bay Company in 1859, 1860. And I think like a lot of Hudsons Bay Company men, it got real boring around the post, you know. If nobody was in town, there's nobody come down. And so while he was waiting for both the Inuvialuit to come up the river and then the Dene, the Athabascan people, to come down the river to bring the skins that they had to trade, he got very interested in collecting natural history objects. And a lot of what he collected were birds. And we've got a huge collection of bird eggs from Fort McPherson area and Fort Good Hope, and bird skins, and he collected fish. There's another pod. There's another place like this, one of the ones down there, that's just floor-to-ceiling glass jars full of fish and snakes and turtles and squirmy, ugly things. And he collected a lot of those, and he sent them all back to Washington. But he got very interested in collecting ethnographic objects.
One interesting thing, before I left Inuvik a few days ago, I talked to William Nasugaro. And his father, Big Joe McFarland. He said he heard his father, Big Joe, speak about McFarland. McFarland again. Old McFarland. So that name was passed, he heard about it.
Yeah.
Big Joe McFarland heard about McFarland from his father and his people ahead of him.
You can see the old tag on this one that said Fort Anderson, McFarland, and then on the back side of the tag there's a little skull and crossbones because it was poisoned in August of 1984 just to keep the bugs. Because you can see some of the bug damage on that one. Anyway, so it's a little embarrassing, but there it is.
Yeah, I'm really impressed with the preservation of the artifacts, the clothing. And we all know in the north, to have something sitting around for that long period of time, they would be all gone by now. So lucky for us, we did have the McFarland, that fella that purchased these weapons, these tools, these clothing, and brought them down here for preservation.
And you have to remember that, at the time, all these things were sort of the day-to-day things that people had. And you could trade one and go home and make another one. And it's really, it's sort of by dint of preservation and the fact that this stuff survives in the museum that have gained value and excitement, over the years.
Well, I just think McFarland is a pretty interesting character, and personally, I like the documentation, or I find it compelling, the documentation that's out there. I like the image of McFarland with all his slavey guides and voyageurs from the south going out to the Anderson River. And these Anderson River people are really feisty and territorial, and they say, yeah, I don't think that you're gonna come on our turf without a fight. And eventually they kind of broker these friendly trading relationships. But McFarland on his side kind of said, wow, these people are really great, they're ready to rip and roar and defend their territory, and I think they would be great trade partners. So neither of them was scared off from the other.
There were good traders and bad traders. And the general sort of feeling that sort of come down through the history and the records was that Mr. McFarland was essentially a sympathetic character, and he was genuinely interested in the people that came to trade and to work with.
I think in those early years, the people who didn't understand or speak the language, they used a lot of motion, signal, like.
I'm not exactly sure what year it was, but in 1861 or 1862, there was a really bad smallpox, measles epidemic, and almost 20% of the Nunavut population perished in that one epidemic. And his collecting stopped almost at that same time.
And there's such a variety, so for someone to be able to get the variety of the specimens that they gathered in those years, it's just amazing. Yeah. Well, it almost looked like he knew exactly what he was going there for, what his purpose was to, and to get it all documented is.
It's very interesting how these old collections and old tools, sort of every generation, get rediscovered and investigated with new eyes.
Chuck, do you ever get these in people bring
Well, see, that's the question. That's a good one to ask. Is it for a baby? Is it something very fancy for a baby? Is it something that some women did to trade with this guy? He's given tobacco for anything, you know. Go home and make a really nice little Parker, and we'll trade it for something.
I'm looking at it like,
take a close look, because it's such fancy work. As opposed to this one, which looks like it really was worn, right?
Yeah.
It really does look like you can almost imagine some kid playing.
That's true.
When Mr. McFarland collected it, he had it cataloged as an infant's deerskin shirt. Whether you want to believe it or not.
See, does it even look like it's been worn?
It doesn't to me. You can look at it. This is 7659.
I would ask Helen, because I'm wondering, if they actually make clothing for babies that small.
I don't. I think the only thing small they ever made was shoes for their little feet.
What about dolls? You know,
That's what I'm
on the
thinking.
Yupik, you know, the Yupik people would make wooden dolls and dress them very, very nicely. Is that something that there's a Nunavut tradition at all? Or?
Actually, in my grandfather's book, Ainulia, he talks about them making baleen dolls, and he said that skill was lost as when, like, old people were dying off because of epidemics. So maybe they did make clothing for dolls too.
Gee, before I left, you know Mabel Chixia? Well, she makes these dolls. She dressed them like a man. She dressed them like a woman. My grandchildren really liked them. So here I was buying them for them.
Yeah.
Yeah, they really liked them too.
Yeah. So women still do make dolls back home, and they're very popular.
Yeah, very popular. I know my wife, right now, she's in her spare time, she's doing quite a few traditional dolls.
And did she make clothing for them?
Yes, yeah.
Skin clothing or?
Right now it's fabric, but fur around the hoods and mitts and boots.
We feel tremendously fortunate, you know, that people like Albert and Helen can come here and they have so much knowledge and wisdom and experience, and it's also funny to see things that sometimes there's something in the collection that they don't know personally from experience, but once they start thinking about it and talking about it, there's memories to conversations they might have had, with their parents and their grandparents. So suddenly being in the pod looking at these old objects, it's like being in a time machine, where you sort of carried back a century or a century and a half, to another time. And there's tremendous respect for northern native peoples and the rapport that they had, with the land. And it's such an important model today when we see the destruction of the ecosystem and the deterioration of so many of the values that are important humanistic values and that are so celebrated when elders talk about the old way of sharing and cultural sharing and interaction. And
because the caribou hair is hollow in the water, it wouldn't sink right away. It'll stay floating. So they would be able to just to tie on by the antlers and then tow them to the shore to pull them up and work on them.
Do you know of places that are crossing areas that would be good for, or do people still do this sort of crossing areas?
Swimming point.
I've done it a few times on the Anderson River and the Anderson Forks.
Oh, you have?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.